Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio.
All right, good morning to all, and thank you for joining us today for the launch of the UN Environment Programme's Emissions Gap Report. The Secretary General will make a few initial remarks, followed by UNEP's Executive Director, Inger Andersen, and then Anne Olhoof, the head of the Climate and Policy Planning of UNEP's DTU partnership. The Secretary General will then take a few questions on climate, and we will have to release him. But Ms. Andersen and Ms. Olhoof will stay to answer remaining questions. You know the drill. If you're off screen, if you're online, just put a question in the chat. Sir, you have the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen of the press, good morning. I welcome my colleague Inger Andersen, Executive Director of UNEP. And we are both here to keep sounding the alarm. Less than 1 week before COP26 in Glasgow, we are still on track for climate catastrophe, even with the last announcements that were made. The 2021 Emissions Gap Report shows that with the present nationally determined contributions and other firm commitments of countries around the world, we are indeed on track for a catastrophic global temperature rise of around 2.7 degrees Celsius. Now, even if the announcements of the last few days will materialize, we would still be on track to clearly more than 2 degrees Celsius. And these announcements are essentially about 2050. So it is not clear how they will be materialized. But even if these recent announcements would materialize, we would still be clearly above 2 degrees Celsius. So, as the title of this year's report puts it, the heat is on. And as the contents of the report show, the leadership we need is off. And far off. We know that humanity's future depends on keeping global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2030. And we also know that so far, parties to the Paris Agreement are utterly failing to keep this target within reach. And the report also shows that countries are squandering a massive opportunity to invest COVID-19 fiscal and recovery resources in sustainable, cost-saving, planet-saving ways. So far, the report estimates that only about 20% of recovery investments will support the green economy. As world leaders prepare for COP26, this report is so another thundering wake-up call. How many more do we need? The recent IPCC report already showed that unless we reduce global carbon emissions by 45% from 2010 levels by 2030, 100 months from now, we will not reach a 1.5 degree future. And scientists are clear on the facts. Now leaders need to be just as clear in their actions. And they need to come to Glasgow with bold, time-bound, front-loaded plans to reach net zero, to decarbonize every sector, from power to transport, farming and forestry, to phase out coal by 2030 in OECD countries and 2040 in all others, to end all coal investment, public and private, national and international, to end subsidies for fossil fuels and polluting industries, to put a price on carbon, and to channel that back to creating green jobs. And obviously, to provide at least $100 billion each year to the developing world for climate finance. The Paris Agreement says that the provision of scaled-up financial resources should aim to achieve a balance between adaptation and mitigation. And so, a balance means 50-50. And I repeat my call to donors and multilateral development banks to allocate at least 50% of their climate support towards adaptation and resilience. The clock is ticking. The emissions gap is the result of a leadership gap, but leaders can still make this a turning point to a greener future instead of a tipping point to climate catastrophe. The era of half measures and hollow promises must end. The time for closing this leadership gap must begin in Glasgow. And I thank you for your attention and am at your disposal.
Thank you very much, sir. I now give the floor to Inger Andersen, the Executive Director of the UN Environment Program. Inger?
Thank you so much. As you've just heard from the UN Secretary General, the heat is very much on when it comes to climate change. 5 days ahead of COP26, climate action is still inadequate. The updated nationally determined contributions and other commitments for 2030, not officially submitted, only take another 7.5% beyond what has already been committed off. So we need to take a total of 55% of our current emission load on the least cost pathway to 1.5 degrees. And if we were to aim for 2 degrees, which we really shouldn't, we'd need to have an ambition of 30% reduction. But the report states we are at 7.5%. As the report demonstrates, the world would need 7 times more ambition to keep us on the 1.5 degree track. And this is a yawning gap that we must close in 8 years. 8 years in which we must increase ambition, make new plans, put in place new policies, implement them, and ultimately deliver the cuts. We can still get the job done, but only if we get moving now, and only if we take advantage of every opportunity. As the emissions gap report in 2021 shows, net zero pledges from 49 countries plus the EU cover half of all greenhouse gas emissions. These pledges could bring a predicted global warming this century down from 2.7 to 2.2, still off track but closer. But they remain ambiguous, vague, and inconsistent with 2030 action, and that must change too. Another option highlighted in the report is methane, a powerful and short-lived climate warming gas. Over 30 countries have joined the US and EU-led effort to cut 30% off of methane emissions by 2030. Such a target is a feasible, low-cost, and particularly through action in the oil and gas sector, which does exist. But rapid action on methane, while necessary, does not let the oil and gas industry off the hook. It is an interim measure on the road to decarbonization. The report also tells us that the opportunity, as we heard to use COVID-19 recovery financing for low carbon recovery has been largely missed so far, but that too can change. Meanwhile, carbon markets could accelerate action by decreasing mitigation costs if grounded in clear rules that ensure transactions reflect actual reductions in emissions. Carbon markets are a part of the much needed effort to provide financing to developing nations so that they can adapt to climate change and follow a low carbon development pathway. But they can't be all of it. We need more solidarity and more financing. Finally, as previous emission gap reports have shown, there's a huge climate potential in nature-based solutions, in renewables, and in energy efficiency, and in so much more. The point is that we know what we need to do, and we even know how to do it. We know the time frame in which we need to act. We know the benefits of action, and the consequences of inaction. The case for climate change is essentially closed. So it's time to get it done. Through stronger commitments that use every option at our disposal, through policies and action, action, action. We need to go firm, we need to go fast, and we need to start doing it now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Inger. Thank you. We'll now turn to Anne Olhoof, the head of climate policy and planning at UNEP. Anne? Anne, are you connected? Can you hear us? Give it a second.
Yes, I'm connected. And sorry for this. I just need to share my screen.
Great. All right. Please go ahead. Go. Okay.
So thank you very much. This is the 12th emissions gap report produced as an independent scientific assessment to inform the international discussions on climate change. And this year is particularly interesting because it's the first year since the adoption of the Paris Agreement that countries have been requested to submit new or updated nationally determined contributions for 2030 in line with the 5-year ambition rating cycle of the agreement. Furthermore, one of the key goals of the upcoming negotiations in Glasgow is to ensure global net zero by around mid-century to keep 1.5 degrees within reach. So against this background, this brief presentation will zoom in on the 3 key questions that you might see on your screen, and we will look at first the impact of the new announced climate mitigation pledges for 2030, both on the emissions projections and also on the emissions gap in 2030. So by the time we're finalizing the report, 121 parties have submitted new or updated NDCs to the UNFCCC, and these cover more than half of global emissions. What we see in general is that these NDCs, the new and updated ones, are more transparent, and also that more of them include greenhouse gas emissions targets than prior NDCs. We also see that they do show progress in terms of enhancing ambition. However, the aggregate impact of these pledges is still relatively limited. So this graph basically shows you the contribution of the G20 members, the contributions of the non-G20 members, and also the contribution of announced pledges not submitted as NDCs at the time of the production of the report. And all in all, the new and updated NDCs are estimated to lower annual predicted greenhouse gas emissions by just under 3 gigatons of CO2 equivalents in 2030. If we also take into account the announced pledges, this reduction increases to just over 4 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. So while it actually narrows the gap slightly for the first time since 2015, since the Paris Agreement, it remains large. As you can see on this slide, the full implementation of unconditional NDCs and other pledges still leaves a gap of 11 to 13 gigatons of CO2 equivalent in 2030 with respect to a 2-degree pathway, and also a gap of between 25 to 28 gigatons of CO2 equivalents with respect to a 1.5-degree pathway. As Inge already highlighted, these new pledges shave off 7.5% in the projected emissions compared to previous pledges, and we would need 4 times higher ambition to get on track to 2 degrees and 7 times higher ambition to get on track to 1.5 degrees. Now, this doesn't take into account the necessary emission pledges that an increasing number of countries have put forward. 50 parties covering more than half of global greenhouse gas emissions have put forward such pledges by now. They still show quite a lot of ambiguity in terms of sectors and gases covered, whether or not they include and how they include offsets, and also in terms of transparency, both regarding the plans for achieving them, but also for how to report and review progress against them. So where does that take us in terms of global warming implications? The Emissions Gap Report 2021 estimates that a continuation of current policies would be consistent with global warming at the end of the century of around 2.8 degrees. And all of these estimates are with a 66% chance. If we fully implement the unconditional NDCs and the other announced pledges, this estimate is lowered to 2.7 degrees. But the real change happens if the 2030 pledges are implemented in combination with the net zero emissions target. As you can see here, the unconditional pledges in combination with the full achievement of net zero target would bring us closer to the Paris Agreement temperature goal. But we're not yet there, and we have to get there. So what we can see is that few of the G20 members' pledges for 2030 actually put their emissions on a clear path towards net zero. And furthermore, as a group, the G20 members are not yet on track to either their previous NDCs nor their new ones. So there's an urgent need to raise ambition and accelerate action, both to bridge the emissions gap and also to get global emissions on track towards net zero. As Inga mentioned, the report covers a lot of other areas, and if we look into fiscal recovery, how to spend that well to accelerate a green transition, and we look into the opportunities for reducing emissions from methane and also into the use of market mechanisms. That's it from my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We'll now take some question. Valeria, please, on behalf of UNCA.
Thank you so much, Stefan. Thank you, Mr. Secretary General, on behalf of ANCA for this press conference. So my question is, how confident you are to be able to reach an agreement among states at COP26 on the objective to reduce greenhouse gas emission in the coming years, and how important is the fact that leaders like Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin will not attend the summit? Thank you so much.
I think all G20 leaders are very important because G20 represents 80% of the emissions. And obviously, there is still, as it was demonstrated, a huge effort to make in order to make sure that not only we reach net zero emissions in 2050 globally, but that there is a meaningful reduction of emissions in the next decade. If there is no meaningful reduction of emissions in the next decade, we will have lost forever the possibility of reaching 1.5 degrees. So this is a moment of truth, and I will be joining the G20 next weekend, and I will be strongly appealing for all of them to do their maximum. There is a principle of national determined, common but differentiated responsibilities according to national capabilities, which means that the leadership must come from developed countries, but the level of emissions of the emerging economies is such that we also need the emerging economies to go an extra mile. Only if everybody does the maximum, it will be possible to get there.
Thank you. Pamela Falk, CBS News.
Thank you, Secretary General, and to UNEP for the briefing. My question is, the report does say that national plans have fallen short. And there's some countries, like China, that have pledged to cut a fossil fuel, but there are no new pledges on the emissions. How can you get countries to do both at the same time, and do you expect that to happen at COP26? Thank you.
Well, first of all, China, like several other countries, have not yet presented their national determined contributions. And my appeal to China is very simple. What President Xi Jinping announced in the General Assembly is that they would reach net zero before 2060, and they will peak the emissions before 2030. And before is the magic word. I think it is very important to make this before as big as possible, because that would be a very important contribution to make our global objectives be met, and that would have an influence on several other countries that are now making pledges in relation to net zero in 2060. And so it's important to encourage everybody to do more.
Thank you. Margaret Bashir.
Secretary General, Margaret Bashir, Voice of America. I'm sorry to just, if you'll indulge me for one moment, it's very important that we have you on camera and on the record about Sudan. If you could just say a few words about the situation, and what have you learned from the situation in Myanmar, which we are now 9 months into and 1,100 lives lost, where there's been a military coup. What does the international community, and specifically the United Nations, need to do differently to reverse the situation in Sudan?
Well, first of all, about Sudan. I once again strongly condemned the forceful military takeover of power in Sudan. And I urge, of course, all stakeholders to exercise maximum restraint, but the Prime Minister and other officials that were unlawfully detained must be released immediately. And it's true that Sudan has achieved important milestones. They cannot be reversed. And so it is essential that all transitional arrangements and institutions as defined in the constitutional document be reinstated. The civilian-military partnership is critical. It needs to be re-established at the level with which it was established. And I think the Sudanese people has shown very clearly their intense desire for reform and democracy. Now, we are seeing a multiplication of coup d'etats. The fact that we have strong geopolitical divides, the fact that the Security Council has lots of difficulties in taking strong measures, the impact of the problems of COVID and the difficulties that many countries face from the economic and social point of view, these three factors are creating an environment in which some military leaders feel that they have total impunity, they can do whatever they want because nothing will happen to them. And my appeal, obviously, is for especially the big powers to come together for the unity of the Security Council in order to make sure that there is effective deterrence in relation to this epidemic of coup d'etats. And we have seen that effective deterrence today is not in place. We have seen it in Myanmar, and we have also seen it in several African locations.
Sherwin Bryce Pease, South African Broadcasting.
Morning, Secretary General. Back to COP26. You've talked about the trust deficit between the developing world and the developed countries, and this comes down in large part to the $100 billion you talk about annually, but we do know that developing countries, led by countries like South Africa, are pushing for this to go up to $750 billion a year come 2025. The concern is in 2020, the deadline for that fund to be capacitated was not reached. How are you going to get a firm commitment from the industrial nations to reach the 750, given that they can't even reach the 100 billion that was due in 2020?
As you probably know, yesterday it was published by ministers Flasbart and Wilkinson that have been charged to prepare a delivery plan on 100 billion. And I would like to express my deep gratitude and appreciation to both of them for the work that they have established. They have presented a report. The report is accompanied by some projections by OECD. I think that they represent a serious contribution, and they deserve a serious analysis and a serious consideration, because what matters, obviously, is the effective delivery of the 100 billion. And I've been campaigning for the need for that delivery, and I hope that this step will help move in that direction.
Thank you. One last question.
It's not enough to have 100 billion. It's necessary also to mobilize more resources from the multilateral development banks, from the private sector, and it is also essential that contributions are more based on grants than loans, and it is also essential that there is an effective balance between adaptation and mitigation.
Thank you. Kirsten Salome, Al Jazeera.
Thank you, Secretary General. Given you're headed to the G20, those nations responsible for 80% of carbon emissions, can you sum up where their NDCs stand, how many have announced them, and what do you need to get from them this weekend? And also, the United States, UN's largest funder, the world's second largest carbon emitter, can't seem to agree on a budget. What is at stake in the U.S. budget negotiations for COP? What do you need to see in there, do you think? How will that affect what's going to happen at COP?
Obviously, it will be impossible to reach 100 billion without a meaningful American financial contribution. That is evident. And my appeal to the American institutions is to make sure that that meaningful contribution can materialize. Obviously, all G20 leaders must understand the need that they need to do the maximum. I cannot tell you exactly how many countries have not yet presented national determined contributions, but I think that probably around almost half of the countries have not presented national determined contributions. Some made announcements of objectives, but obviously an announcement for 2060 without a program of action to get there has the value that it has. So it is absolutely essential that all G20 countries present before Glasgow or in Glasgow national determined contributions that are compatible with 1.5.
Thank you. One last question, and then we have to let the Secretary General go, but we'll continue on with Ms. Anderson. Celia, Voice of America.
Thank you. Secretary General, in the report, how do you see the relation between migration, forced migration, and climate change? We know Latin America and Guatemala, the dry corridor is one of the areas, and we have seen now massive movements from South America all the way to Mexico. How do you see that, especially because you have experience with refugees, and what's your take on that and how the world leaders could make a change?
I think climate change is clearly an important accelerator of migration. In some situations, because several regions become simply not inhabitable anymore, and so people have to leave because they have no conditions to survive. Desertification, as you know, is progressing in many areas. On the other hand, several habitats are being impacted, and the resources that are available in those habitats are also forcing people to leave because they cannot find opportunities, and they cannot find even sometimes the minimum conditions of food security in particular. On the other hand, climate change accelerates other factors, including factors that can lead to conflict. In many places of the world, particularly in Africa, look at the Sahel, we have farmers and herders, and the relationship between farmers and herders can be harmonious, but when resources dwindle, water becomes more scarce, they tend to enter into conflict. And so climate change, again, is an accelerator of conflict. It's not the only cause, but it's an accelerator of conflict, and conflict drives displacement. So it is clear for me that climate change is today one of the most important factors in the acceleration of migration movements.
So thank you very much. I know we have to let the Secretary General go. He has another climate speech in front of the General Assembly.
I have the General Assembly.
Yes, exactly. More climate. But we are delighted to stay with Inger Anderson and Ann Hulhoff, who will continue to take questions on the report. I think I'll turn to Joe Klein from Canada Free Press. Joe.
Yes, thank you. The Secretary General has called for OECD countries to phase out coal by 2030. Yet, despite his pledge to no longer build new coal-fired power projects abroad, China is continuing to add dozens of coal-fired electric power plants at home. So I'd like to know what your message is to China, the largest emitter of greenhouse gases, concerning its announced increase in coal mining and the building of coal-fired plants at home. And to what extent has the GAP report taken China's announced new coal-fired plants into account in its objectives? Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe I start here, if I can. And essentially what we would say is, first of all, we would encourage all countries, as the Secretary General has done, to step out of coal. That becomes critical. The report before you does take into account all the announceables that have been made, both in terms of the net zero pledges as well as in terms of the NDCs. 2 weeks ago, we issued a report we called the Production Gap Report, where we look at what our country is planning to do in terms of their production of gas, coal, and oil. And in that report, not today's report, but the report that we released just a short time ago, we show that governments, and this includes China, but let me hasten to add, I'm projecting 240% more coal, 57% more oil, and 71% more gas. So whilst that's not the topic of this press conference, the truth is that we are not where we need to be with respect to the hydrocarbon sector. And it becomes absolutely critical because we shouldn't be whistling out of two sides of our mouth here. And the pledges that have been made need to be reflected in the Cs and need to therefore provide domestically the policy guardrails for new exploration that is intended. Stefan?
Thank you. Thank you very much. We'll now go to Dong Liu from Chinese media. Dong Liu. Okay, let's try Urmi from the Economic Times of India. Urmi, can you hear us? Okay, we're not having much luck. Mr. McCarthy, I can see you, so please go ahead. If you could introduce yourself as well. Yes, if you could introduce yourself. Thank you.
Thank you. It's Danica McCarthy from The Independent London. My question is, in the light of today's disastrous emissions gap, the International Energy Agency said we should have an immediate ban on all fossil fuel investments, coal, gas and oil from this year, if we're to achieve net zero 2020. So my question is, why is UNDP or the Secretary General not calling on the COP to implement the IEA ban on all new investments in fossil fuels? Thank you.
If I may, I think what we are saying here is that we need to step out and step down from hydrocarbons, and that we need to also figure out how we are making that transition. And what that will entail is to avoid that we have energy shortages, as we are seeing in some places now, is that we enable proactive engagement for investment in renewable. And that is done by government policies, and that is done by incentivizing, and that is done by banks leaning in and by ensuring that we have these longer term investments. At this point, calling for an end for certain fossil fuel investments is, of course, a clear call from IEA when they look at the trajectory, and we understand that. However, we are in that process of transition, and right now what we want to see is clarity in the NDCs and clarity in the net zero commitments that have been made, so that there is no fudging and no vagueness around what the promises are. And further, as we heard from the Secretary General, we are not doing ourselves a favor by kicking the net zero can down the road to 2050. We need to see real action between now and 2030. That's what we're calling for at the COP.
Is that not a fudge by you?
I think if the time when we have the opportunity to turn off all fossil fuel and everyone still has lightings and the hospitals are still working, I think at that point, indeed, yes. But right now, we're not seeing the investments, which we have to see. And so the imperative now is on focusing on investing in the three sectors that are the carbon emitters. It is energy, it is transport, and it is infrastructure and buildings in cities. These are the three sectors that we're focusing on, and these are the three sectors that need to make these shifts.
Thank you.
But if we invest $5 trillion in new fossil fuels, what hope have we got of net zero?
Stefan, do you want me to come back? I can come back, but we can take it into a dialogue.
Yeah, exactly. Let's move on. Hilde de Wachter from EcoTips.
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, okay. Yes, I was wondering, okay, the report is based on what countries are going to do or are not going to do, but what can companies, what can businesses do individually or in their sector
to help closing the gap? What is their role? Clearly here, I think what we're looking for is that businesses lean in on net zero, lean in on shifting their portfolios, lean in on transparently reporting on their carbon footprint in their production in the entire supply chain. This is not happening now, in part because there are so many methods by which businesses calculate this. So looking at finding similarity and ensuring that we have an equal playing field for reporting on carbon footprint and not using greenwashing, etc. We are looking very much at the big investment portfolios that we see in the financial sector, because that is where the big shifts will be coming up. And we are hoping very much to see at COP26 some announceables from the financial sector that is obviously the biggest investors in fossil fuel that needs to shift its investments out. But we have to understand that these are your mortgages and mine. This is not easy to do, because one thing is to shift out of hydrocarbon investments for production, but the broader issue is shifting out of the overall carbon footprint. And that is complex and will also put a degree of burden on those taking these loans through banking sectors.
Thank you. Neil Kamal from the Times of India. Neil?
Good evening.
Yes, we can.
Now when the world is at the please. Now as the world is at the doorstep of very crucial global climate summit at a time when the climate crisis having been turning into climate emergency, necessitating emergent actions. Do you think that the nations are ready to take the corrective measures to reduce the GHG emissions in real sense, not only making shallow claims? Are the rich nations ready to pay the committed $100 billion as assured for poor nations? So how much hopeful you are from the outcome of this summit?
At this point, we've reached 80 billion. It's not where we want to be. And as we just heard also, of course, that is very much the floor. So it's very clear that for climate justice, for equity, for intergenerational justice, and to make the transition and to enable these investments to go into the developing world, we will need to ensure that we have the 100 billion. This was first mentioned in